The constant high-pitched whine of a metal grinder bled through the thin drywall. A sound Sarah had learned to tune out like a chronic headache. It was the soundtrack to her life, a monotonous drone punctuated by the percussive blast of an impact wrench and the guttural shouts of men in greasy overalls. Her tiny apartment, a converted storage room in the back of an auto body shop, was permanently saturated with the acrid perfume of industry, the metallic tang of oil, the sharp chemical bite of paint thinner, and the faint, dusty smell of old rubber. She sat hunched over her sewing machine, the needle a tiny silver predator dancing over a torn seam. Her fingers, raw and pricked, ached with a deep, familiar pain. Outside, the sun was setting, but in here, it was always twilight, the only window facing a grimy brick wall. Her 7-year-old son, Matthew, slept on a mattress on the floor, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm of innocence she felt she no longer deserved. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it felt like a physical weight, settled over her shoulders. She felt the vibration from the shop floor travel up through the legs of her chair, a constant, unsettling tremor, a reminder of just how precarious her entire world was. Her phone screen, a spiderweb of cracks, glowed with the cruel, final number, $87. She stared at it until the digits blurred, the sum a mockery of her tireless work. $87 to shield them from the street, to feed her growing boy, to exist for one more week, or maybe just a few more days. A sharp, gnawing pain twisted in her stomach, a hunger that was now more familiar than fullness. She had given Matthew the last of the bread and the single egg for dinner, telling him she wasn't hungry, a lie that felt like acid on her tongue. The eviction notice lay on the small, wobbly table, its bold red letters a brand of failure. 3 months past due. Final notice. She closed her eyes, the words seared into her memory. She could almost feel the cold, slick paper in her hands. Slowly, as if in a trance, she walked the 2 steps to the refrigerator and pulled the door open. A weak, yellow light illuminated the vast, white emptiness. A single, half-empty bottle of ketchup stood like a lonely monument to better days. The cold, sterile air that rushed out smelled of nothing. It was the smell of absolute lack. A sob caught in her throat, hot and sharp, and she felt the crushing weight of her failure press down, making it hard to breathe. The memory came unbidden, as it often did in these moments of quiet desperation. Her father's face, not angry, but worse, disappointed, cold, his eyes devoid of the love she had once known. Her mother stood behind him, clutching a Bible to her chest, her lips a thin, unforgiving line. "You have made your bed in sin, Sarah," her father's voice had echoed in the pristine, silent hallway of their home. "You cannot lie in it here." The solid, final click of the front door locking behind her was a sound that had never left her. They hadn't just kicked her out. They had amputated her from the family, from her entire life, for the unforgivable crime of carrying Matthew. She glanced over at her sleeping son, a beautiful, perfect boy who knew nothing of the sin his very existence represented to his grandparents. A fierce, protective love surged through her, a powerful current that momentarily pushed back the tide of despair. But it was followed immediately by a tremor of pure terror. He was the one bright light in her world, and she, his only protector, was failing him. Her hands, which could mend any fabric, felt utterly useless, unable to stitch their broken life back together. The landlord, a heavy man named Stan, whose breath always smelled of stale coffee, had been by yesterday. His heavy boots had stomped on the concrete outside her door, each footfall a hammer blow against her frayed nerves. 3 months, Sarah! 3 months! His voice had boomed through the thin wood, not even bothering with pleasantries. "I've got a family to feed too, I can't be a charity." She had spent the entire day on the phone, her voice growing hoarse as she chased down potential mending jobs, her pleas met with a chorus of polite refusals. "We're all set for now," they'd say, or worse, just silence on the other end. The stress had coiled into a tight, throbbing knot at the base of her skull, a constant companion to the dull ache in her lower back from being perpetually hunched over her work. The air in the tiny room felt thick and suffocating, each breath a struggle. The relentless noise from the garage, once a background hum, now felt like a personal assault, each clang and bang chipping away at her sanity. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her, and she gripped the edge of her sewing table to steady herself. The world tilting precariously on its axis, Sarah stared at the needle of her sewing machine, frozen in place mid-stitch. It seemed to mock her. This tool of her trade that could no longer earn them survival. The single bare bulb overhead cast long, dancing shadows that made the cramped room feel like a cage. Tears began to fall, not in a storm of sobs, but in a silent, steady stream, tracing cold paths down her tired face. It was the kind of crying she did now, a quiet surrender when there was no energy left to fight. She looked at Matthew, his face so serene in sleep, and a terrifying thought pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. What will happen to him when the $87 run out? When Stan changes the locks? The thought was a black hole, pulling all light and all hope into it. There was no one to call, no family to run to, no safety net to catch them. She was completely and utterly, terrifyingly alone. If you've ever felt trapped with no way out, you know the darkness Sarah is feeling right now. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because her story is about to take a turn she could never have predicted, and you won't want to miss a single second of what happens next. It arrived on a Tuesday, wedged into the crack of her door, an anomaly of crisp cream-colored paper against the grimy, oil-stained wood. Her name, Sarah Jenkins, was typed in a severe, official font. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the paper feeling impossibly clean and foreign under her calloused fingertips. There was no sound from the auto shop for a moment, a rare pocket of silence that felt charged with significance. She held her breath, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Bills were never this formal. Eviction notices were red and angry. This was something else. With a deep, shuddering inhale that smelled of rust and damp concrete, she tore the envelope open. The paper inside was heavy, bearing the embossed letterhead of a law firm in a town she'd never heard of. Her eyes scanned the dense blocks of text, catching on phrases that didn't seem real. Last will and testament. Great-aunt Ilara Vance. Sole beneficiary. A hysterical laugh, thin and reedy, escaped her lips. The letter stated, in cold, legalistic terms, that a woman she barely remembered from a single family gathering in her childhood had passed away. Ilara Vance. The name conjured a vague image of a woman with kind eyes and hands that smelled of cinnamon and soil. The letter continued, hereby bequeaths her only significant asset, a property located at, followed by a rural address in West Virginia, a cabin, and the land it sat on. Sarah sank onto the lumpy mattress next to Matthew, the legal document shaking in her grip. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't a miracle cure for all her problems, but it was a roof, a solid, tangible roof that no one could take from them. A wave of light-headedness washed over her as the implications crashed down. No more Stan pounding on the door, no more breathing in paint fumes while she slept, no more rationing food until her own stomach cramped in protest. A single hot tear splashed onto the page, smudging the ink. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of a desperate, fragile hope. This was it. The sign she had stopped praying for because she felt her prayers were falling on deaf ears. Hope, an emotion she thought had been permanently extinguished, flickered to life in her chest, a weak but persistent flame. She felt a surge of energy so potent it made her want to scream. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a frantic, buzzing determination. She looked at the cracked phone displaying her meager $87. Then she looked at the eviction notice on the table. There was no choice, not really. Staying meant a slow, grinding slide into homelessness. Leaving was a gamble, a blind leap of faith into the unknown, but it was a leap towards something. She scooped Matthew into her arms, burying her face in his hair, which smelled of sleep and innocence. "We're going on an adventure, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We're going home." The decision settled in her bones, firm and absolute. She would sell the sewing machine, her last vestige of a failed life, and use every cent to get them there. The next morning, the pawn shop smelled of dust and desperation. The air was thick with the silent stories of 100 other broken dreams, embodied by the tarnished silver E, forgotten instruments, and lifeless electronics lining the shelves. Sarah placed her sewing machine on the counter. It was a heavy, sturdy model, her one expensive possession, bought in a time when her freelance business felt full of promise. The man behind the glass barely glanced at it. He poked it with a grimy finger. his face a mask of practiced indifference. $75, he grunted, the words hanging in the stale air. Sarah's heart sank. It was worth 10 times that. Please, she began, her voice cracking. It's in perfect condition. I need to buy bus tickets for my son and me. The man just shrugged, a gesture of final, weary dismissal. 75, he repeated. She felt a cold wave of nausea. It was highway robbery, but he held all the power. Defeated, she nodded. The cash he counted out felt greasy and wrong in her hand. It was the price of her escape. The bus station was a chaotic symphony of human misery and transit. The high, echoing ceilings amplified every sound, the garbled announcements over a crackling PA system, the frantic cries of tired children, the lonely sobs of someone saying goodbye, the rumble of idling engines that vibrated through the soles of her worn-out shoes. The air was a nauseating cocktail of diesel exhaust, stale popcorn, and unwashed bodies. Matthew, clutching her hand, looked around with wide, curious eyes, too young to sense the undercurrent of desperation that permeated the place. For him, it was an adventure. Sarah forced a smile for him, a painful stretching of muscles unaccustomed to joy. Her own stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. She counted the money again. After buying the one-way tickets to a place called Canaan Valley, she had less than $40 left. It wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. But it had to be. A shiver of fear, cold and sharp, traced a path down her spine. There was no turning back now. The bus groaned away from the curb with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a sigh of relief. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass of the window, watching the grey, familiar landscape of the city slide by. The auto body shop, the grimy convenience store, the pawn shop, each landmark of her failure receded into the distance, and with each one, a single thread of tension in her soul seemed to snap. She breathed out, a long, slow exhale, feeling the tight band around her chest loosen for the first time in months. Matthew was already chattering excitedly, pointing out trucks and tall buildings. Sarah listened, her responses automatic, her mind a whirlwind of fragile hopes and terrifying what-ifs. The rhythmic drone of the engine was a hypnotic lullaby, and the steady motion of the bus felt like progress, like movement away from the abyss. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of pure, unadulterated fantasy. A small, clean cabin, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of baking bread. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing light outside the window. The flat industrial sprawl of the city slowly gave way to rolling hills, then to the dense, imposing green of the Appalachian Mountains. The air itself seemed to change, losing its chemical bite, and taking on the rich, earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles that drifted through the open window vents. With every mile that clicked by on the highway, Sarah felt the suffocating weight of her old life lifting. The constant, high-pitched whine of the grinder in her memory was replaced by the low hum of the tires on asphalt. The knot of pain at the base of her skull began to dissolve. She watched the mountains rise up around them, their peaks shrouded in a soft, mysterious mist. It felt like entering another world, a primeval land untouched by the kind of grime and struggle that had defined her existence. A genuine smile touched her lips as she looked at Matthew, who had finally fallen asleep, his head resting on her lap. Her heart ached with a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. Optimism. She gently stroked Matthew's hair, her mind racing ahead to their new life. She envisioned a small vegetable garden in the yard, its rows neat and tidy. She could teach Matthew how to plant seeds, how to feel the rich soil between his fingers. They would have fresh food. Maybe there were berry bushes in the woods. She imagined the quiet mornings, the only sound being the chirping of birds instead of the roar of engines. She would find work in the nearest town, whatever it took. Mending clothes, cleaning houses, anything. In her mind, the cabin was simple but sturdy, a cozy haven. She pictured a stone fireplace, a warm bed, a kitchen that, even if it was small, would be clean and full of food. These images were a balm to her frayed nerves, a desperate prayer she repeated to herself over and over. This wasn't just an escape from eviction, it was a chance at rebirth, a place where the label of sinner and failure couldn't follow them. The hope was so potent, so vivid, it felt like a tangible thing she could hold in her hands. The bus let them off with a final hiss of its air brakes at a desolate crossroads. A single, rust-eaten signpost pointed down a narrow dirt lane, Black Bear Hollow. The bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking in the distance until they were swallowed by the encroaching twilight, leaving Sarah and Matthew in an unnerving, profound silence. The sheer absence of noise was a shock. There were no cars, no sirens, no distant hum of civilization, only the whisper of the wind through the towering trees that lined the road, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. "Is this our new home, Mummy?" Matthew asked, his small voice sounding loud and fragile in the stillness. "Almost there, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice sounding unnaturally cheerful. She hoisted their single, heavy suitcase and started walking. The dirt road was uneven, and with each step, a small stone or lump of earth seemed to press into the thin soles of her shoes. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air began to creep up her arms. The isolation felt less like peace and more like a trap. They walked for what felt like an eternity. The suitcase grew heavier with every step, its handle digging painfully into her palm. The sun dipped below the mountain ridge, plunging the hollow into a deep, purple gloom. The trees pressed in on either side of the road, their tangled branches like skeletal fingers reaching for them. A sense of unease, thick and cloying, settled over Sarah. The beautiful, wild nature that had seemed so promising from the bus window now felt menacing, claustrophobic. Every rustle in the undergrowth made her jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel Matthew's fear, a low hum of anxiety that transmitted itself through his small, tight grip on her hand. Her own carefully constructed fantasy of a cozy cabin began to crumble at the edges, replaced by a raw, primal fear of the unknown. The hope that had carried her all this way began to feel flimsy, naive. A cold dread started to pool in the pit of her stomach. Something felt deeply, terribly wrong. Her throat was dry, and she swallowed against a rising lump of panic. And then she saw it. Through a break in the trees, perched on a slight rise, was the cabin. But it wasn't the quaint, sturdy haven of her dreams. It was a skeleton, a jagged scar on the landscape. Sarah stopped dead in the road, the suitcase dropping from her numb fingers and landing with a dull thud in the dirt. Her breath caught in her throat, a strangled gasp of disbelief. The roof on one side had completely caved in, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. The porch listed at a drunken angle, its support posts rotted through. The windows were dark, vacant holes, some with shattered panes of glass that glinted menacingly in the fading light. The wood of the walls was weathered to a splintery, ghostly grey, covered in creeping vines and dark, ominous stains. It wasn't just neglected, it was derelict. It looked like it had been in a losing battle with the forest for decades, and the forest had won. All the air seemed to rush out of her lungs, leaving a hollow, aching void where her hope had been just moments before. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb. Hesitantly, as if approaching a wild, wounded animal, she walked the final few yards. Matthew clung to her leg, his face buried in her jeans. The front door hung crookedly on a single hinge. She gave it a gentle push. The sound it made was not a creak, but a long, groaning screech of tortured metal and splintering wood that echoed in the oppressive silence. The smell that billowed out hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to recoil. It was a thick, suffocating stench of decay, the damp, earthy perfume of black mold, the sharp, acidic tang of rat droppings, and the foul, stagnant odor of rot that had steeped into the very bones of the house for years. She felt her stomach heave, and she swallowed hard against a surge of bile. It was the smell of absolute abandonment, the smell of something that had died and been left to fester. The carefully painted picture in her mind of a sunlit kitchen and baking bread shattered into a million pieces, replaced by this putrid, horrifying reality. Her entire body began to tremble. Stepping over the threshold felt like crossing into a nightmare. Her foot landed on something soft and squishy, and she let out a small cry of disgust, snatching it back. Inside, the gloom was nearly absolute. The little light that remained filtered through the hole in the roof, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. Water stains ran down the walls like dark, weeping sores. A thick layer of grime and cobwebs coated every surface. A rusted wood-burning stove stood in one corner, its pipe disconnected and hanging precariously. The floorboards were warped and buckled, and in the corner where the roof had collapsed, a pile of wet, rotting debris was slowly being reclaimed by moss and fungus. She could hear it now, the faint, dry scuttling of unseen things in the walls and under the floor. A rat, maybe, or a whole family of them. A shiver of pure revulsion crawled up her spine. This place wasn't just unsafe, it was diseased. The air was so thick and damp it felt like she was breathing water. Desperate for a single sign that this could be salvaged, she stumbled back outside, her eyes scanning the property. The letter had mentioned a well. She saw it a few yards from the cabin, a low stone ring with a dilapidated wooden covering. A wave of frantic hope surged through her. If there was water, they could clean. They could survive. She hurried over, Matthew trailing behind her, and peered over the edge. The covering was half rotted away, and she could see the water below. It was dark and still, and a greasy, rainbow-colored film coated its surface. A cluster of pale green scum floated near the edge. The smell that rose from the depths was sour and metallic. It was the smell of contamination, of poison. She felt the last, fragile thread of her hope snap. No electricity, no shelter from the rain, and now, no clean water. They were utterly, completely stranded in a place more destitute and dangerous than the one they had fled. The isolation was no longer a concept. It was a physical presence, pressing in on her from all sides. Sarah sank to her knees on the damp, overgrown ground. The fight went out of her completely, replaced by a despair so profound it was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. She had gambled everything on this one, desperate chance. And she had lost spectacularly. She had spent their last dollars to drag her son across the country to a ruin. A wave of shame and self-loathing washed over her, hot and suffocating. She was a fool, a naive, desperate fool. The silence of the hollow pressed in, broken only by the rustle of the wind and the sound of her own ragged, shallow breaths. She looked at Matthew, his small face pale with confusion and fear in the deepening twilight. He was depending on her, and she had led them here to this dead end. The despair was a black, icy tide pulling her under. She had thought she was at the bottom back in the city. She was wrong. This was the bottom, a cold, isolated, and inescapable pit of failure. Tears started to stream down her face, silent and hot, as the full magnitude of her mistake settled upon her like a shroud. The night that fell upon the hollow was absolute, a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Sarah, frozen on the damp earth, felt the day's residual warmth being sucked away, replaced by a creeping, invasive cold that numbed her fingers and toes. The cabin was now a silhouette of deeper black against a sky without moon or stars, a jagged hole in the fabric of the world. She could hear Matthew's breathing, shallow and quick beside her, and the sound was a tiny, fragile anchor in an ocean of terrifying silence. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees, a low, sibilant sound that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It sounded like a warning, a profound, primal fear, colder and sharper than the evening air, gripped her. She had to move. She had to get her son out of the open, even if the only shelter available was the very heart of their new nightmare. Taking a ragged breath that tasted of damp soil and decaying leaves, she pulled her son to his feet, the ruin looming before them like an open mouth. With a strength born of pure, maternal terror, she forced herself to cross the threshold once more. The groan of the single, rusted hinge was a scream in the stillness. Inside, the suffocating smell of mold and rot was even more potent in the enclosed space, a physical presence that coated the back of her throat. She fumbled in her purse for her phone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. The weak, bluish light of its flashlight cut a pathetic swathe through the oppressive gloom, illuminating a scene of abject squalor. Dust motes, thick as insects, swarmed in the narrow beam. The light danced over water-stained walls, a floor littered with fallen plaster and unidentifiable debris, and a gaping hole in the ceiling where the darkness of the sky pressed down. A cold drop of water landed on her cheek, and she flinched, wiping it away with a trembling hand. It felt oily, unclean. Her stomach churned with a mixture of revulsion and despair. She had brought her child to live in a tomb, a place that was actively and aggressively falling apart around them, a place where the very air felt diseased. They had to sleep somewhere. The thought was absurd, a hysterical joke. Sleep, here. Her light beam scanned the small rooms, searching for the least destroyed corner. The main room was out of the question. with the gaping wound in its roof. She found a small back bedroom, barely larger than a closet, where the ceiling seemed mostly intact. The floor, however, was a minefield of warped, buckled planks. In one corner, a pile of what looked like old rags and sodden newspapers lay decomposing. Using her foot, she shoved the foul-smelling pile away, revealing a patch of floor that was relatively clear. A dry, rasping scuttle from within the wall made her blood run cold, and she froze, listening, her ears straining against the silence. It was the sound of rats, of things living in the decay. She felt a wave of nausea so powerful she had to brace herself against the wall, the rough, damp wood pressing into her palm. She laid her own thin coat over the dirty floorboards. "Here, baby," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Lie down here. It's our new bed." Matthew, bless his innocent heart, was too exhausted to protest. He curled up on the coat without a word, his small body tight and tense, and was asleep in moments. But for Sarah, sleep was an impossible luxury. She sat on the floor beside him, her back pressed against the cold, damp wall, her phone's dying flashlight beam pointed at the doorway. She was a sentry guarding a crumbling fort. Every sound was magnified in the crushing silence of the hollow. The drip, drip, drip of water from the ruined roof became a form of torture, each drop landing with a hollow plink that echoed the beat of her own terrified heart. The moan of the wind outside the broken window panes sounded like a person crying, and beneath it all, the constant, unnerving rustles and scratches from within the walls, the secret life of the cabin's other inhabitants. She felt a profound and suffocating loneliness, an isolation so complete it felt like being the last person on earth. She held her breath, listening, waiting for a sound that she couldn't identify but feared with every fiber of her being. As the hours crawled by, the battery on her phone died, plunging them into absolute, terrifying blackness. The loss of that tiny light was a physical blow, leaving her blind and exposed. Now her ears were her only defense. She strained to hear over the pounding in her own chest, her imagination populating the darkness with unseen horrors. Was that a floorboard creaking in the other room, or just the house settling? Was that the scrape of a branch against the glass, or was something trying to get in? Tears of pure exhaustion and fear streamed silently down her face, but she made no sound, not wanting to wake Matthew. She felt her sanity fraying at the edges, worn thin by stress and hunger and the relentless, suffocating darkness. She thought of her warm, brightly lit childhood home, of her father's stern face, and a wave of anger, hot and sharp, cut through the fear. They had cast her out, left her to this. This ruin was the end point of their judgment. She pulled Matthew closer, his sleeping warmth the only thing tethering her to the present moment. Morning did not arrive with a gentle dawn, but with a slow, grudging leakage of grey light that seeped through the grime on the windows and the hole in the roof. The pale, unforgiving light was crueler than the darkness, revealing the full extent of the cabin's decay with brutal clarity. The water stains on the walls looked like livid bruises. The cobwebs, thick and ancient, were shrouds draped over every corner. A fine layer of greenish mold seemed to coat every surface that wasn't covered in dust or rat droppings. The smell was still there, thick and cloying. Sarah's body ached with a deep, penetrating cold and the stiffness of having slept on the hard floor. Her stomach was a hollow, aching pit. For a long moment, she just sat there, looking at the ruin in the daylight, feeling the last vestiges of her fighting spirit drain away. But then she looked at Matthew, still sleeping, his face smudged with dirt, and she knew she couldn't surrender. To give up was to let this place win, to let it swallow them whole. A spark of defiance, small but fierce, ignited in her chest. She would not let her son grow up in a place that smelled of death. She would clean. It was a futile, absurdly optimistic act, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. But it was something. It was an action, a refusal to be a passive victim of her circumstances. She got to her feet, her joints protesting with a series of creaks and pops. She searched the dilapidated kitchen area, her hands running over surfaces coated in a slick, greasy film. Behind a cabinet door that hung from a single hinge, she found what she was looking for, an old, stiff-bristled broom. The handle was rough and splintery, but it felt solid in her hands. It was a weapon, a tool, a symbol of her intent to fight back against the decay. Taking a deep breath of the foul air, she returned to the small bedroom and began to sweep. The harsh scrape of the bristles on the wood, a satisfyingly aggressive sound in the morning quiet. It was a declaration of war against the ruin. Matthew woke to the sound of her sweeping. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and looked around the grimy room with a child's unfiltered honesty. "It's yucky here, Mummy," he said, his voice small. Sarah's heart clenched, but she forced a determined smile. "I know, sweetie. That's why we have to clean it, to make it our home." The word home sounded like a lie on her tongue, but she said it with as much conviction as she could muster. She needed him to believe it, because if he believed it, maybe she could too. "Can I help?" he asked, always eager to be a part of her world. "Of course," she said, her voice softening. "You can be in charge of the floor. Make sure it's all clear for me to sweep." It was a make-believe job, but it gave him a purpose. As she wrestled with a thick, sticky cobweb in the corner, Matthew got down on his hands and knees, exploring the terrain of the ancient wooden floorboards with the intense focus only a 7-year-old can possess. He was in his own world of canyons and ridges in the wood grain. He ran his small fingers over the rough, uneven planks. The wood was old, worn smooth in some places and splintery in others. He traced the dark lines between the boards, imagining they were roads for tiny, invisible cars. The floor was a landscape of dust and history. He pretended he was an archaeologist, discovering a lost city. In the center of the room, one of the boards felt different. When he pushed on it, it didn't feel solid like the others. It moved, just a little, with a faint, low groan. Curiosity piqued. He pushed on it again, harder this time. It dipped downwards, then popped back up. It was like a secret button. He glanced up at his mum, who was still battling the spiderweb, her back to him. This was his secret, his discovery. He hooked his small fingers into the crack at the edge of the board. The wood was rough, and a small splinter jabbed his finger, making him wince. But he was determined. He pulled. The board resisted for a moment, then shifted with a scraping sound. "Mommy," he said, his voice a hushed whisper of excitement. "Look." Sarah turned, distracted from her cleaning. She saw Matthew kneeling on the floor, his face alight with discovery, his fingers gripping the edge of a floorboard that was clearly out of place. "What is it, honey? Be careful. You'll get splinters." She walked over, her brow furrowed with concern, but then she saw what he was pointing at. The board was loose, not just warped or buckled like the others, but distinctly, unnaturally loose. A flicker of something, not yet hope, but a sharp, intense curiosity pierced through her exhaustion. She knelt beside him, the knees of her jeans soaking up the dampness from the wood. "What did you find, my little explorer?" she asked, her voice gentle. She placed her own fingers alongside his and tested the board. It wiggled easily in its setting. It wasn't nailed down. It had been cut, intentionally. The sounds of the dripping water and the moaning wind seemed to fade into the background. A new kind of silence fell over the room, charged with a sudden electric tension. Sarah felt a prickle of adrenaline, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. Her hands, which were so adept at the delicate work of threading a needle, now felt clumsy and large. She worked her fingertips into the gap, the raw, splintery edges of the wood digging into her skin. She ignored the sting. With a deep breath, she pulled upwards. The board resisted. Wedged tight by years of damp and disuse, she grunted with the effort, putting her back into it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a long, groaning screech of wood against wood, the board gave way. She lifted it free and set it aside, revealing not the dirt and joist she expected, but a small, perfectly square, black opening. A crawl space. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It was a deliberate, hidden space. The air that rose from the hole was different from the rest of the cabin. It wasn't the smell of wet rot. It was a dry, dusty scent, the smell of time itself, of things long forgotten. Her heart was now hammering against her ribs, a frantic, wild bird trapped in a cage. Matthew peered into the darkness, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Is it treasure, Mommy?" he whispered, the words hanging in the tense air. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't know what it was, but it was something. Something hidden. Something secret. In a place full of decay and despair, this was a pocket of intention, of purpose. The darkness in the hole was absolute, a void that seemed to absorb the weak morning light. She needed to see what was inside. Her own phone was dead, but she remembered Matthew had a small keychain flashlight he'd gotten from a cereal box, a cheap plastic toy he treasured. "Matthew, where is your little flashlight?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He scrambled to his feet and dug into the pocket of his jeans, producing the tiny red rocket ship. It was a toy, but its small LED bulb was bright. She took it from him, the cheap plastic feeling impossibly significant in her trembling hand. She lay on her stomach on the dirty floor, the dampness seeping through her shirt, and aimed the toy flashlight's narrow, wavering beam into the darkness. The crawlspace was small, maybe 3 feet square and lined with rough-hewn timber. The floor was just dry, packed earth. For a moment, she saw nothing but more dust and cobwebs, and a crushing wave of disappointment began to wash over her. It was just an old access panel, forgotten and empty. But then, as she moved the beam of light into the far corner, it caught on something. It wasn't a glint of gold or the sparkle of a jewel. It was a dull, rectangular shape, half covered in dust. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a box, a small metal box, its surface obscured by a thick patina of rust that glowed a deep, angry orange in the flashlight's beam. It sat there in the dark, silent and waiting. It had been waiting for a very, very long time. The sight of it sent a jolt through her system, a pure, unadulterated shock that momentarily silenced all her fears. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she reached into the hole, her arm disappearing up to the shoulder into the cold and dusty darkness. Her fingers brushed against the rough, gritty surface of the box. It was cold, colder than the surrounding air, with a deep, profound chill that seemed to seep into her fingertips. It was heavier than she expected. She grasped it, her fingers finding purchase on its dented edges, and carefully, painstakingly, pulled it out of the crawlspace and into the grey light of the room. She set it on the floor between her and Matthew. It was a simple, utilitarian thing, a small cash box or document safe, maybe a foot long and 8 inches wide. The rust was thick, covering almost the entire surface in a crust of reddish-brown decay. A simple, flat latch on the front was sealed shut, fused by the same corrosion. It was locked not by a key, but by time and neglect. A tangible piece of the past, unearthed from its grave beneath the floorboards. "Can we open it?" Matthew breathed, his face a perfect picture of excited anticipation. The question hung in the air. Sarah stared at the box, her mind racing. What could be inside? Old coins, forgotten deeds, or just more dust and disappointment? The possibility of that last option was a cold knot in her stomach, but the mystery was too powerful to ignore. This box felt like the first real thing that had happened to her, not just something she had to endure in years. She needed to know. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to open it." She looked around the debris-strewn room, searching for a tool. Her eyes landed on a long, rusted piece of metal, part of the broken stovepipe. She picked it up. It was heavy and sharp on one end. It would have to do. Kneeling before the box as if it were an altar, she wedged the sharp edge of the pipe into the seam beneath the rusted latch, preparing to pry it open. She put her weight into it, grunting with the effort. The pipe scraped against the box with a high-pitched, metallic shriek that set her teeth on edge. The rust was like cement holding the lid fast. For a moment she thought it was hopeless. The box would keep its secrets, but she was not the same woman who had arrived here yesterday. That woman was defeated. This woman had found a purpose. She adjusted her grip, found a better angle, and pushed again, this time with a surge of desperate, focused anger. There was a sharp crack, a sound like a breaking bone, and the latch snapped. It flew across the room and clattered against the far wall. Silence descended once more, thicker and more expectant than before. The box was unsealed. With a hand that trembled visibly, she lifted the lid. It opened with a low, mournful creak, releasing a puff of air that carried a scent she hadn't smelled in years, the faint, dry, almost sweet smell of old paper and dried ink. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like yellowed cotton batting, was a small, neat bundle of envelopes. They were tied together with a piece of simple twine, the bow still perfectly intact. The paper was brittle and cream-colored with age, the edges soft and worn. Sarah lifted the bundle out of the box with the reverence one would reserve for a holy relic. It was surprisingly light. She didn't need to see the name on the envelopes. She knew. She recognized the sharp, elegant slant of the handwriting instantly, a script that was burned into her memory. A jolt, sharp and painful, went through her. It was Richard's handwriting. Her Richard, the man who had whispered promises to her under a summer sky, the father of her child, the ghost who had haunted every moment of her life since he had vanished without a trace 8 years ago. Her breath hitched, and her vision blurred with sudden, hot tears. It was a message from a ghost, delivered to this ruin. Her fingers trembled so badly she could barely work the knot on the twine. The string fell away, and the letters shifted in her hand. The top envelope was addressed not to her, but to Ilara Vance, her great-aunt. The return address was a post office box in a town she didn't recognize. A storm of emotions warred within her. The old, familiar ache of abandonment, a surge of white-hot anger at his silent disappearance, and a desperate, all-consuming need for answers. Why had he been writing to her great-aunt? What secrets did he share with this distant relative that he couldn't share with her, the woman carrying his child? She felt a profound sense of betrayal. A wound, she thought, had scarred over reopening with a fresh, searing pain. She had to force herself to breathe, to push down the wave of grief and confusion that threatened to overwhelm her. The answers, whatever they were right here, in her hands. After all these years of silence, Richard was finally going to speak. Beneath where the letters had been, there was something else. Several small, black plastic canisters, the kind used for 35mm film. She picked one up. It was cool and smooth in her palm. She popped the lid off one of them. A tightly wound spool of photographic negatives slid out. She held the strip up to the grey light filtering through the window. The images were alien in their inverted state, black and white phantoms of people and places she couldn't recognize. A man's face, dark against a light background. A room filled with objects. A document. The text, unreadable. It was another layer of mystery. A visual puzzle to accompany the written one. Who were these people? What story did these silent, ghostly images tell? The box was not just a collection of letters from a long-lost love. It was a curated collection of evidence, a time capsule of a secret, assembled with care and hidden away from the world for a reason. Her heart pounded with a new kind of fear, a fear mixed with a thrilling, dangerous sense of purpose. She carefully placed the negatives back in the box and reached inside one last time. Her fingers brushed against something soft and crinkly at the very bottom. She pulled it out. It was a paper napkin, folded into a tight, small square, its texture delicate and fragile. It was yellowed with age, and a faint dark stain that looked like coffee marred one corner. With painstaking slowness, she unfolded it, her breath held tight in her chest. The paper was so brittle, she was afraid it would turn to dust in her hands. As she flattened it out, a crude, hand-drawn map was revealed, sketched in what looked like faded blue ballpoint pen. It was unmistakably a map of the property. She could see the rough outline of the cabin, the circle that must represent the stone well, and a distinct Y-shaped tree off to one side. And there, in a small clearing a short distance from the tree, was a single, bold, unmistakable X, an X, the universal symbol for a hidden location, for buried treasure. A dizzying wave of vertigo washed over Sarah. She gripped the edge of the open crawl space to steady herself. Treasure, the word, the concept, was so outlandish, so far removed from the grim reality of her life that her brain could barely process it. For years, her world had been defined by lack, by the relentless calculation of cents and dollars, by the gnawing ache of an empty refrigerator. The idea of treasure belonged in the stories she read to Matthew, not in the gritty, desperate landscape of her own existence. Yet, here it was, a map, an X, a promise of something hidden beneath the soil of this blighted, ruined property. The despair that had crushed her just this morning, the suffocating weight of her failure, was suddenly gone, burned away by a surge of pure, high-octane adrenaline. This box wasn't just a key to her past. It might be the key to her future. It was a new kind of hope, but it wasn't the gentle, fragile hope of a safe home. This was something different. It was the sharp, dangerous, and thrilling hope of an answer. The air in the room felt different now. The smell of mold was still there. The dampness still chilled her skin, but it was all secondary. The focus of the entire world had narrowed to the contents of this rusted metal box. The letters from a ghost, the cryptic, spectral images on the negatives, and the impossible promise of a hand-drawn map. Each discovery was a new question, a new locked door. Who was Richard writing to her great-aunt? What was he so afraid of that he had to hide this evidence? What crimes were captured on these film negatives? And the biggest question of all, the one that made her pulse thunder in her ears and her hands tremble with a terrifying excitement, what was buried at the spot marked X? She looked at the map, then at her son, whose eyes were still wide with the magic of it all. This discovery had changed everything. They were no longer just victims, huddling in a ruin. They were guardians of a secret. And she, Sarah, was no longer just a failed seamstress. She was about to become a detective. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a crime scene. It was a library. It was a treasure island. The weight of the rusted box in her lap felt more real than the hunger in her stomach or the cold in her bones. For the first time since she had stepped off that bus, she felt a flicker of power. It wasn't the power of money or security, but the power of knowledge, of holding a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. The wind howled outside, no longer sounding mournful, but conspiratorial, as if it were whispering the secrets of the hollow to her. The dripping water was a ticking clock, counting down the moments until the truth was revealed. She carefully gathered the letters, the negatives, and the precious, fragile map, placing them back inside their metal sanctuary. She closed the lid, the soft click of the metal echoing in the quiet room. She had a choice to make. She could ignore this, try to survive, and pretend this box never existed. Or she could open Pandora's box and face whatever truths and whatever dangers came flying out. Looking at Matthew's hopeful face, she knew there was no choice at all. Her old life of quiet desperation was over, destroyed the moment her son had pulled up that loose floorboard. She was standing at a crossroads she never knew existed. One path led back to the slow, grinding misery she had known for years. The other path led into the dark, tangled woods of Richard's past, guided by a ghost's map. It was a path fraught with unknown dangers, but it was also the only path that held the slightest glimmer of redemption. She ran a hand over the rough, rusted surface of the box. A sense of resolve, cold and hard as steel, settled in her heart. She would read the letters, she would find a way to develop the negatives, and she would follow that map. She would dig up the truth, no matter how deep it was buried or how ugly it turned out to be. The mystery had been unearthed, and she was going to solve it. Her very survival, and her son's, might now depend on it. A strange energy coursed through her veins, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was no longer just a single mother trying to keep a roof over her son's head. She was a woman on a mission. This isolated, ruined cabin, which hours ago had been the symbol of her ultimate failure, had transformed into something else entirely. It was now the epicenter of a story that had been waiting decades to be told. She felt a connection not just to Richard, but to her great-aunt Ilara, the silent keeper of this secret. Why had she never said anything? Was she protecting Richard, or was she afraid? The questions multiplied, each one branching into a dozen more. Sarah stood up, the metal box held tight against her chest like a shield. She looked out the broken window at the dense, dark woods. The world outside the cabin was no longer just an empty, isolated wilderness. It was now a landscape of clues, a place where an X marked a spot, and where answers were waiting to be dug out of the cold, hard earth. She hid the box, wrapping it in her coat and tucking it deep into the corner of the small bedroom, piling the foul-smelling rags back over the top of it. It was her secret now, hers and Matthew's. The act of hiding it was a commitment. She was in this all the way in. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. It was the thrill of the unknown, the fear of what she might uncover. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her life had been irrevocably split into two distinct parts, the time before the box and the time after. The quiet desperation of her previous existence was gone, replaced by the loud, dangerous, and compelling pull of a mystery. Her purpose was no longer simply to survive the day. Her purpose was to unravel the secret that had been hidden beneath her feet all along. She had been given a map, and she was determined to follow it, wherever it might lead and whatever the cost. After a restless, fear-filled night, Sarah waited until Matthew's soft, even breathing confirmed he was deeply asleep. The oppressive silence of the cabin pressed in on her, but it felt different now, charged with the electric hum of the secret it held. She moved with a stealth she didn't know she possessed, her bare feet making no sound on the warped floorboards. She retrieved the cold, heavy box from its hiding place, her fingers tracing the rusted edges. The weight felt immense, a physical anchor to a dark and terrifying past. With trembling hands, she lifted the creaking lid once more. The dry, dusty scent of old paper and forgotten time billowed out, mingling with the ever-present stench of mold and decay. She carefully lifted out the bundle of letters, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She was about to let a ghost speak, and she was terrified of what he would have to say. She chose the top letter, the paper so brittle and yellowed it seemed a strong breath could turn it to dust. The envelope was addressed to Ilara Vance, and as Sarah unfolded the single sheet inside, the date at the top sent a chill through her entire body. It was dated just 2 weeks before Richard had vanished from her life forever. His handwriting, usually so confident and elegant, was jagged and frantic. The ink bled slightly in places as if from a trembling hand. "Dearest Ilara," the letter began, and the words seemed to whisper through the room. "I pray this finds you. I have nowhere else to turn. If you are reading this, it means I have trusted the right person." Sarah felt a knot of ice form in the pit of her stomach. The loving, carefree man she remembered was gone, replaced by this terrified, desperate stranger on the page. She had to strain to read the next lines. His words a confession from beyond the grave. "My father is not the man the world thinks he is," Richard wrote, and the words were a hammer blow to Sarah's heart. "He is a monster, Ilara." Her predator cloaked in a judge's robes. A sickening wave of validation washed over her. She'd always been unsettled by Judge Caldwell's cold, watchful eyes. The way his smile never seemed genuine. Richard's words confirmed her deepest, unspoken instincts. During the war, he didn't serve the country. He served himself. He used his position of power, the chaos of the times, to extort and ruin people. Good people. People who spoke out against the government, who questioned his authority. He financially destroyed them, seizing their assets under the guise of legal penalties. The sheer scale of the corruption he described was dizzying, a web of deceit and cruelty that made the air in the cabin feel thick and hard to breathe. The frantic script then focused on a single, horrific story, the Martinsons. Remember them? The journalists from the state capital. They were investigating him. They had found proof, documents that would have exposed his entire extortion ring and sent him to prison for life. The name Martinson hung in the air, heavy with a sense of impending doom. Sarah had to grip the page with both hands to stop them from shaking. Richard's sentences grew shorter, more clipped, as if he was forcing each word out. He found out they were close. He didn't just silence them with threats. Ilara, he erased them. Their 2 children, they just vanished. Say cold case. No bodies ever found. The casual horror of it, the simple, brutal efficiency of the crime, sent a wave of bile rising into Sarah's throat. She felt like she was going to be sick. Then came the gut-wrenching reveal of the map. He took everything they had saved, family heirlooms, jewelry, and a small cache of gold coins passed down through their family, and he buried it. On your land, Ilara, your isolated, forgotten patch of dirt. He bragged to me once, years ago, that it was the perfect hiding spot. Who would ever look for a fortune on a poor old woman's worthless property? The X on the napkin, the symbol of hope, was instantly transformed into a mark of desecration. It wasn't a treasure chest. It was a grave marker for a family's legacy filled with blood money. The sudden, violent shift from the fantasy of riches to the reality of a horrific crime hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless and hollowed out by the sheer evil of it. Richard's own torment bled through the page, his guilt a palpable thing. I found his ledger, tucked away in his study. He kept records of everything, even the coordinates for the buried gold. He was that arrogant. When I confronted him with it, he laughed. Ilara, he looked me in the eye and he laughed. The image of the powerful, respected judge laughing about murder made Sarah's blood run cold. He told me I was weak and sentimental, just like my mother. He told me I had a simple choice: accept my inheritance and the legacy of power he had built, or become another one of his unfortunate loose ends. The threat, echoing from 8 years in the past, felt immediate and real, sending a tremor of pure ice down Sarah's spine. She finally understood. Richard hadn't been running from her. He had been running from his own father. The final letter was a testament of love and a desperate, last-ditch plan. I can't go to the police. He owns half the judges and lawmen in this state, and I can't come back to you, my Sarah. He knows about you, about the baby. He will use you both against me without a second thought. The only way to protect you is to disappear completely, but I cannot let him win. I am hiding the proof here, with you, Ilara. You are the only person he would never suspect of defiance. The negatives are photos I took of the ledger and some of the stolen jewelry. These letters are my confession and my testimony. Sarah pulled the brittle pages to her chest, a raw, ragged sob finally breaking free from her throat. He hadn't abandoned them. He had sacrificed himself to protect them. The grief was a fresh, gaping wound, an agony for the life they were supposed to have. The chilling implication of the letter's final lines settled over her like a shroud. I will find a way someday to bring this all into the light. But if something happens to me, Ilara, if I don't contact you again in 6 months, you must take this to someone outside the state, someone with federal power. Avenge them. Please, avenge me. The letter ended there, without a signature. He had never contacted his great-aunt again. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been silenced, murdered by his own father. A new emotion, cold and hard as steel, began to solidify in Sarah's heart, extinguishing the grief with its righteous fury. This was no longer just about finding a safe place to live. This was about justice, for the man she had loved, for the innocent family who had been erased, for her son, asleep in the next room, who deserved to know his father was a hero, not a coward. The following day, the knowledge of the secret poisoned the air. The dripping water sounded like a countdown. The sighing wind sounded like a warning. Sarah felt a suffocating paranoia descend upon her. Every snap of a twig outside made her jump, her heart seizing with fear. The cabin was no longer a ruin, but a vault, and she was its terrified, unqualified guard. She tried to maintain a facade of normalcy for Matthew, playing games with him on the dirty floor, but her senses were stretched to their breaking point. Her ears strained. Listening past the sounds of the decaying house for one specific noise she prayed she would never hear: the low, approaching rumble of an engine coming up the long, lonely dirt road that was their only connection to the outside world. She kept the box within arm's reach at all times, its cold metal shell a constant, terrifying reminder of the danger they were in. The sound came in the mid-afternoon, a low, confident growl that was utterly alien to the wilderness. It wasn't a farm truck or a local's battered pickup. It was the purr of a powerful, expensive engine. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. "Inside, now!" she hissed at Matthew, grabbing his arm and pulling him back into the shadows of the cabin. She clamped a hand over his mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "Shh, baby. Not a sound." Peeking through a tiny crack between 2 weathered boards, her breath caught. A sleek, black sedan, gas polished to a mirror shine, was gliding up the rutted lane, its presence an obscene violation of the hollow's solitude. The car stopped directly in front of their ruin, the engine cutting off with a soft, final sigh, plunging the clearing into a dreadful silence. The driver's side door opened with a quiet, solid click that spoke of money and precision engineering. A man stepped out, and Sarah felt all the air leave her lungs in a silent gasp. He was in his 70s, but stood straight and tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored tweed jacket and dark trousers that seemed immune to the surrounding squalor. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he moved with an unhurried grace that radiated absolute power and control. Even from 50 feet away, Sarah knew. The cold dread that washed over her was a physical sensation, a wave of ice water flooding her veins. It was Judge Caldwell, the monster from the letters, the man who had murdered his own son. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently, she was sure he could hear it from across the clearing. He didn't hesitate or look around uncertainly. He approached the cabin with the casual proprietary stride of a landowner inspecting his domain. His expensive leather shoes, miraculously clean, barely seemed to touch the muddy, leaf-strewn ground. A placid smile was fixed on his face, a mask that did nothing to warm the cold. Calculating depths of his eyes as they swept over the collapsed roof and shattered windows. "Hello," his voice boomed, smooth and resonant, yet with an undercurrent of pure steel that cut through the air. "Is anyone there? I was passing by and saw the smoke from a fire." Sarah froze, a fresh wave of panic washing over her. The small, smoky fire she'd built outside to boil water, it was a beacon, a stupid, naive mistake that had announced their presence to the one man on earth she needed to hide from. She knew hiding was now impossible. It would only confirm his suspicions. She had to face him, taking a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm the wild fluttering in her chest. She pushed the groaning cabin door open and stepped out onto the listing porch. She instinctively moved to shield Matthew, who peeked out from behind her legs. "Can I help you?" she asked, horrified at how thin and reedy her voice sounded. The judge's smile broadened, a predator's satisfaction. "Ah, so there you are. You must be Sarah Jenkins. I'm Judge Caldwell. I own most of the surrounding land. I was a dear friend of your great-aunt Ilara." The lie was so audacious, so effortlessly delivered, it made Sarah's stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. His gaze flickered past her into the cabin's dark, squalid interior, his eyes cataloguing the decay with an air of theatrical disdain. "I was so sorry to hear of Ilara's passing," he continued, his voice a river of false sympathy. "When I heard you'd inherited this property, I felt I had to come and check on you. This is no place for a woman and a young boy, as you can see." He made a dismissive gesture at the woods that pressed in on them. "Frankly, it's an eyesore and a liability, so I want to make you an offer to help you out. I will take this land off your hands, let's say $5,000, cash. It would be enough for you and the boy to get a bus ticket and a fresh start somewhere more civilized." The offer was a calculated insult. It was a pittance, barely enough to cover a few months' rent, let alone the value of the land. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a probe, a baited hook to see if she knew the real value of the dirt beneath her feet. Sarah's mind spun, the ghost's words from the letters warring with the smiling monster in front of her, the buried gold, the evidence, the murders. It all swirled in a vortex of terror and indecision. She could feel his cold, penetrating gaze on her, dissecting her, searching for any flicker of knowledge in her eyes. She fought to keep her expression blank, to project an air of weary defeat. I don't know," she stammered, the words feeling thick and clumsy in her dry mouth. "I'll have to think about it." The judge's smile tightened, the thin mask of civility cracking. The warmth vanished from his voice, replaced by a soft, menacing purr. "Don't think too long, my dear," he said, taking a step closer. "This is a dangerous, isolated place. Things happen out here. The wildlife can be aggressive. Old structures collapse without warning. Tragic accidents. It would be a terrible, terrible shame if something were to happen to you or that beautiful son of yours. What would you do? Would you take the money and flee, leaving a killer to walk free? Or would you stand your ground on this cursed patch of earth, risking your life and your child's for a justice you might die trying to achieve?" The judge's threat was not a sound that faded. It was a physical presence that remained long after the crunch of his tires had been swallowed by the hollow's oppressive silence. The words, "tragic accidents," coiled in the air, venomous and shimmering. Sarah stood frozen on the listing porch, her hand clamped over Matthew's shoulder, a desperate, protective gesture. The world around her, which had felt merely menacing before, now felt actively predatory. The whisper of the wind through the pines was no longer a neutral sound. It was the judge's voice, a soft, sibilant promise of violence. A cold sweat, slick and icy, broke out across her forehead and down her spine. Nausea, sharp and acidic, churned in her empty stomach, a physical manifestation of the pure terror that had taken root in her soul. She felt as if the very ground beneath her feet was unstable, that the ruin she stood upon was about to crumble into a grave meant for her and her son. The isolation was no longer a hardship. It was a cage. She looked down at Matthew, whose small face was a mask of confusion, his eyes wide as he tried to process the cold menace that had radiated from the smiling man in the tweed jacket. The judge's threat hadn't just been directed at her. It had been an arrow aimed directly at the center of her world. Had this innocent boy who knew nothing of buried gold or his father's murdered ghost. The thought of a tragic accident, Matthew falling into the contaminated well, a beam from the rotten roof collapsing on him as he slept, was not an abstract fear. It was a vivid, horrifying image that flashed behind her eyes, so real she could almost feel the phantom pain of it. Her heart seized with a ferocity that stole her breath. This wasn't about justice anymore, not really. It wasn't about Richard or the Martinsons. It was about survival. It was about the primal, non-negotiable duty to keep her child breathing. Judge Caldwell had made a fatal miscalculation. He hadn't threatened a victim. He had cornered a mother. The $5,000 offer echoed in her mind, not as an insult, but as a countdown. It was a clock, ticking down the seconds until Caldwell's patience ran out. He didn't expect her to take it. He expected her to run or die. Her mind, frantic and buzzing with adrenaline, latched onto a single desperate idea. The map, Richard's crude drawing on the napkin. It had shown the cabin, the well, the X, but she remembered something else in the corner of the drawing. A small, hasty sketch of another structure, further down the hollow, labeled with a single name, Peterson. It was miles away, a terrifying trek through unknown wilderness. But it was the only other sign of human life on this cursed map. It was a long shot, a gamble even more desperate than the bus ride that brought her here. But staying was not a gamble. It was a certainty. Staying meant waiting for the accident to happen. Running gave them a chance, and however slim, to find an ally, a witness, a way out of this nightmare. The internal debate was a silent, frantic war waged in the space of a heartbeat. Could she trust a stranger? What if this Peterson was one of Caldwell's men, another cog in his corrupt machine, placed here to watch over his buried secrets? The paranoia was a suffocating blanket, making her doubt everything, even the ink on the napkin map. But the alternative was a certainty of horror. The image of the judge's cold, lifeless eyes as he spoke of accidents was seared into her brain. He was not a man who made idle threats. He was a man who erased people. The risk of running toward an unknown neighbor was a terrifying possibility, but the risk of staying was a guaranteed end. The primal instinct to protect her child screamed louder than her paranoia. She had to move. She had to run. Now, before the sun set, before the hollow was plunged back into that predatory, absolute darkness that she now knew served as the judge's accomplice. Without a word, she spun around and re-entered the cabin, moving with a speed she didn't know she possessed. Her hands, shaking but sure, went to the hiding spot. She grabbed the rusted metal box, its cold weight a terrifying and essential burden. She stuffed it into the flimsy backpack she had carried their spare clothes in, the corners of the box digging into the thin fabric. She grabbed their only water bottle, now half full of the smoky, boiled water from the morning fire. There was no time for anything else. No time for food, for her coat, for sentiment. "Come on, Matthew," she said, her voice a low, urgent hiss. "We're going for a walk. It's a game. We have to be very, very quiet." She grabbed his small, warm hand, his bewildered trust a sharp pain in her chest, and pulled him toward the back of the cabin, away from the road, away from the direction the judge's sleek black car had disappeared. They slipped out the back, melting into the deep, menacing shadows of the woods. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of damp, rotting leaves that whispered and sighed under their feet. Thorny vines snagged at their clothes like grasping fingers, and low-hanging branches, unseen in the deep shade, whipped at their faces. Every sound was magnified, distorted by fear. The frantic chatter of a squirrel became an alarm bell. The snap of a twig under her own foot sounded as loud as a gunshot, making her flinch and freeze. Her heart hammering against her ribs as she listened for sounds of pursuit. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the earthy scent of decay and damp soil. It was hard to breathe, the air feeling too heavy to draw into her panicked lungs. She held Matthew's hand in a grip of iron, her eyes darting constantly from side to side, scanning the deep, impenetrable gloom between the ancient trees. The woods were no longer a place of nature. They were a labyrinth, and she could feel the phantom presence of a minotaur hunting them through its dark corridors. The sun began to dip below the high Appalachian ridge, and the forest plunged into a deeper, more treacherous twilight. Long, grotesque shadows stretched and writhed, turning familiar shapes into monstrous forms. Matthew began to stumble, his small legs exhausted, his quiet whimpers of, "I'm tired, Mommy," like tiny daggers in Sarah's heart. Without breaking stride, she scooped him up into her arms. His weight, combined with the backpack containing the heavy metal box, was a crushing burden. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. But she didn't slow down. The image of Judge Caldwell's face was a fire at her back, propelling her forward. Pain was temporary, exhaustion was manageable, but the fate the judge had promised them was absolute. So she pushed on, her body a machine running on pure, uncut maternal terror. Her only thought to put as much distance as possible between her son and that smiling, silver-haired monster. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the deepening gloom, an eternity measured in aching muscles and panicked breaths, she saw it. Through a gap in the thick, gnarled trees, she saw a flicker of yellow light. It was impossibly faint, a tiny pinprick in an overwhelming sea of blackness, but it was there. It was a light in a window. It was a sign of human life. A wave of relief so potent it made her knees buckle washed over her, and she had to lean against the rough bark of a massive oak tree to keep from collapsing. Tears of exhaustion and fragile, desperate hope streamed down her face, mingling with the sweat and dirt. It had to be Peterson's. It had to be. The light was a beacon, a promise of sanctuary, a potential end to this terrifying, desperate flight through the dark. She adjusted Matthew in her arms, took a deep, shuddering breath, and forced her screaming legs to move toward that tiny, distant star. But as she drew closer, her relief curdled back into sharp, cold paranoia. The cabin came into view, a small dark shape with a single, glowing eye. Unlike her own ruin, this one was whole, a thin ribbon of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a ghostly finger pointing at the starless sky. It looked safe, too safe. What if this was all part of the judge's elaborate trap? What if Peterson was his loyal watchdog, and this warm, welcoming light was the lure, designed to draw in the very people the judge wanted to silence? Her steps faltered at the edge of the tree line. She was a moth, drawn to a flame that might either offer warmth or incinerate her completely. She could feel the cold metal of the box pressing into her back, a heavy reminder of the secret she carried. To reveal it to the wrong person would be a death sentence, not just for her, but for Matthew, who was now sleeping, his head buried in her shoulder. She stood there for a long, agonizing minute, a ghost at the edge of the clearing, torn between two impossible choices. Turning back into the woods meant a night in the cold, unprotected dark, where any sound could be the judge's men. Moving forward meant placing her life and her son's brow into the hands of a complete stranger. The memory of Richard's last letter, his desperate plea for Ilara to trust someone, to find help, echoed in her mind. Richard had trusted his great-aunt. His great-aunt, in turn, had lived next to this man, Peterson. It was a chain of trust, old and fragile, but it was all she had. With a silent prayer, she made her decision. She squared her shoulders, walked out of the cover of the trees, and stepped into the pale yellow light spilling from the cabin window. Her appearance was a horror story. Her face was scratched and smeared with dirt, her clothes were torn, and she clutched her sleeping child like a shield, her eyes wide with a hunted, animal terror. Before her knuckles could even touch the solid wood of the door, it swung inward with a soft creak. An old man stood silhouetted in the warm light from within. He was tall and gaunt, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles, his shoulders slightly stooped with age, but his eyes, under a shock of unruly white hair, were sharp and startlingly clear. He held a half-empty mug of what smelled like coffee, and he didn't look surprised or alarmed to see a terrified woman and child materialize out of the darkness on his doorstep. Instead, his expression was one of profound, weary sadness, as if he were looking at a ghost he had been expecting for a very long time. His gaze dropped to the sleeping boy in her arms, then back to her face, and a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or grim recognition, softened his hard features. "You'd better come in," he he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The night air isn't good for the boy. Or for you." He stepped back, holding the door wide. The moment Sarah crossed the threshold, the sheer difference between this space and her ruin was a physical shock. The air inside was warm and dry, filled with the comforting, smoky scent of a wood fire and the rich, dark aroma of brewing coffee. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth, casting a gentle, dancing glow over a room that was meticulously clean and orderly. Polished wood floors, a comfortable-looking armchair, shelves lined with books. It was a haven, a sanctuary. The sudden shift from the cold, predatory darkness of the woods to this pocket of warmth and safety was too much for her frayed nerves. A choked sob escaped her lips, and her legs finally gave out. She sank to her knees just inside the door, still clutching Matthew tightly, the heavy backpack sliding from her shoulder and thudding to the floor. The built-up dam of terror and exhaustion finally broke, and she began to weep, deep, ragged, silent sobs that shook her entire frame. The old man, who she knew must be Peterson, didn't rush to her or offer platitudes. He simply closed the door, shutting out the oppressive night. The solid click of the lock a sound of profound finality. He walked over and gently, with surprising strength in his old, gnarled hands, took Matthew from her arms. "Let me take him," he said softly. "He can sleep on the sofa by the fire. He'll be warm there." Sarah, too exhausted to resist, let him. He laid Matthew on the worn cushions and covered him with a thick, hand-stitched quilt. Then he went to the stove and poured a second mug of coffee, placing it on a small table beside her. He sat down in his armchair, waiting patiently for the storm within her to pass. He seemed to understand that she didn't need words or questions just yet. She needed a moment to feel safe, a moment to breathe air that wasn't thick with the stench of fear and decay. His quiet, unassuming presence was a balm to her shattered soul. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "He threatened us," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. "Judge Caldwell, he came to the cabin. He knows I'm here. He talked about accidents." The words spilled out, a torrent of fear and confusion. She told him everything, about the letter from the lawyer, the ruin of a cabin, the loose floorboard, the rusted metal box. She pointed to the backpack on the floor. "Richard's letters are in there. My Richard. He was the judge's son. The judge killed him. He killed a family named Martinson. It's all in there. The proof. And a map. To gold he buried on Ilara's land." She finally fell silent, drained and empty, the whole sordid, terrifying story laid bare in the warm, firelit room. She watched his face, desperate for a reaction, for belief, for anything other than dismissal. Mr. Peterson didn't look shocked. He didn't even look surprised. He just nodded slowly, a deep, grim understanding settling over his weathered features. He took a long, slow sip of his coffee, his sharp eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth, as if seeing images from the past in them. "I know," he said, his voice low and heavy with the weight of decades. "I didn't know the details, not about the gold or who he'd killed, but I knew he was a monster. And I knew your great-aunt Ilara was terrified of him." He leaned forward, his gaze finally meeting hers, and his eyes were filled with an ancient anger. She never spoke his name aloud. She called him the shadow that owned the valley. She said he had a darkness in him that could swallow the sun. She stayed in that ruin, letting it crumble around her, because she was too afraid to leave and too afraid to sell the land to him. She knew he wanted it for a reason. A dark reason. The old man stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the impenetrable blackness of the night. His reflection was a ghostly image superimposed over the dark, shifting trees. "I saw them, you know," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a confession shared with the night itself. "It must have been close to 40 years ago now. I couldn't sleep. One of those hot, still summer nights. I saw lights over on Ilara's property, not fire. Lanterns bobbing through the trees." He turned back to face her, his eyes burning with the intensity of the memory. "I crept closer, through the woods. I saw a group of men. They were digging. A younger, black-haired Caldwell was with them, pointing, giving orders. He wasn't a judge then, just some powerful government man, but he had the same coldness in his eyes, the same arrogance. They worked for hours, their shovels making this awful, rhythmic sound in the quiet of the night, a sound of digging graves. He sank back into his chair, the energy seeming to drain out of him. He ran a trembling hand over his face. I should have done something, gone to the sheriff. But Caldwell already had his hooks in everyone back then. The sheriff was his cousin. I was a young man with a new family. I was afraid. I told myself it wasn't my business, that they were probably just burying trash or a dead animal. His voice was thick with a guilt that had clearly festered for decades. But I knew, deep down, I knew it was something else. The way they worked, in the dead of night. The way Caldwell looked, like a wolf guarding a kill. I was a coward. I went back to my bed and pretended I hadn't seen a thing. It's a shame I've had to live with every day since. The confession hung in the air, a heavy, sorrowful thing, connecting his past inaction to her present terror. Then, years later, the boy started visiting Ilara. Peterson continued, his voice regaining some of its strength. Richard, I recognized him from the papers, the judge's son. He didn't look like his father. There was a kindness in his eyes, but it was being eaten away by something terrible. He looked like a man seeing ghosts in broad daylight, a haunted man. He looked directly at Sarah, his gaze unwavering. He came to me once, asked me if I ever saw anything strange on his great-aunt's land. He had a desperate energy about him. I think he already knew the truth. He just needed someone else to confirm the darkness he suspected. I was still a coward then. I told him I kept to myself, that I didn't see anything. I lied to him. He closed his eyes, a pained expression on his face. The last time I saw him, he told me he was trying to right a terrible wrong. He asked me to watch over Ilara, to keep an eye on her and the property. Then he was gone, and I knew the judge had finally silenced him. Sarah listened, mesmerized, as Peterson filled in the last missing pieces of the puzzle. Every word he spoke was a nail in Judge Caldwell's coffin. Peterson was the witness, the one person who could corroborate Richard's letters, the one person who could place Caldwell at the scene of the crime. The validation was a strange, cold comfort. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining the danger. The ghost story was real, and the monster was real, and this old, guilt-ridden man had seen it all. She finally understood why Richard had hidden the proof here. It wasn't just isolated land. It was land watched over by two people he trusted, his great-aunt and the quiet neighbor who he suspected knew more than he let on. He had created a triangle of trust, a last, desperate defense against his father's evil, and now all that was left of that defense was her, and this old man, and the rusted metal box sitting on the floor. As if on cue, the world outside exploded. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the room in a stark blue-white glare, freezing them all in a silent tableau of terror. It was followed an instant later by a deafening crash of thunder that rattled the very foundations of the small cabin. The storm had arrived. Fat drops of rain, driven by a sudden violent wind, began to lash against the window panes, a frantic, drumming sound like 1,000 angry fists. Matthew stirred on the sofa, whimpering in his sleep, and Sarah instinctively moved to his side, stroking his hair, her own heart pounding in time with the storm's fury. The warm, safe sanctuary of Peterson's cabin suddenly felt terribly fragile, a tiny wooden raft on a vast, violent ocean of darkness and chaos. The storm was a physical manifestation of her terror, a wild, uncontrollable force mirroring the violent turn her life had taken. The rain fell in blinding sheets, a solid wall of water that erased the world outside the windows. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound that rose and fell like a chorus of grieving spirits. It was the perfect storm, the kind of night where anything could happen, where sounds were swallowed by the gale, and a person could vanish without a trace. The flickering firelight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of the room, turning the cozy space into a chamber of shifting, uncertain shapes. Sarah felt a new kind of fear, a primal terror of the storm itself, added to the specific, targeted fear of Judge Caldwell. They were trapped. The dirt road would be a river of mud, impassable. There was no running, no escape. They were marooned on this tiny island of light, surrounded on all sides by the storm and by the judge's encroaching menace. Mr. Peterson's face was grim, his eyes dark with worry as he stared out the window into the maelstrom. "This is bad," he muttered, more to himself than to her. This is the kind of night he likes, the kind of night where things get messy. He turned to face her, his expression hard. He won't wait long. Now that he knows you're here, and that you refused his pathetic offer, he will assume you've found the box. He's not a patient man, Sarah. He doesn't leave loose ends flapping in the wind. He ties them off, permanently. The bluntness of his words sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. The abstract threat of accidents was gone, replaced by the certainty of a violent, deliberate attack. The judge wasn't going to wait for a beam to fall. He was going to send someone to make it fall. The storm wasn't their protector. It was their enemy's cover. The tension in the small cabin became a palpable thing, as thick and suffocating as the humid air. Every crash of thunder made Sarah jump, her muscles coiling tight, her mind screaming that this was it. This was the sound of her door being kicked in. She couldn't sit still. She paced the small space, a caged animal, her ears straining to hear anything beyond the roar of the wind and rain. Peterson remained in his chair, but he was no longer relaxed. He sat ramrod straight, his gnarled hands gripping the arms of the chair, his jaw tight. They were two strangers, a young mother and an old man, bound together by a decades-old crime and a shared mortal enemy. They were a flimsy, makeshift family, waiting in a wooden box for the wolves to come, while the world raged and tried to tear their shelter apart. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one a small lifetime of fear. Sarah's eyes kept returning to the rusted metal box on the floor. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy in the flickering firelight. That box was everything. It was Richard's confession, his love letter, his last will and testament. It was the Martinsons' only chance at justice. It was her only leverage, her only proof, her only hope of ever being free from the shadow of Judge Caldwell. And it was her death warrant. The weight of it, the responsibility, just was crushing. She felt a hysterical urge to throw it into the fire, to watch the letters and the negatives curl into black ash, to erase the secret and pray the judge would then leave them alone. But she knew it was too late for that. She had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. She couldn't unknow what she knew. She couldn't unsee the evil in the judge's eyes. Her only path was forward, through the heart of the storm. Then, through the cacophony of the storm, came a new sound. It was alien and mechanical, a sound that did not belong in the wild symphony of the wind and rain. Faint at first, a low growl that was almost indistinguishable from a distant roll of thunder, but it grew steadily louder, more defined. The unmistakable sound of an engine struggling against the mud. A vehicle. Sarah and Peterson exchanged a look of pure, undiluted terror. It wasn't the confident purr of the judge's sedan. It was something heavier, angrier, a truck, and it wasn't coming towards them. The sound was coming from the direction of her ruined cabin, just down the hollow. It stopped. The engine cut out, and for a moment the only sound was the howling wind. The silence where the engine had been was more terrifying than the noise itself. They were here. Peterson moved with a speed that belied his age, silently crossing the room to a small window that faced down the valley. He motioned for Sarah to join him, his finger pressed to his lips. She crept over, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, she could see them. Two pinpricks of light, cutting feeble swaths through the driving rain. Flashlight beams. They were moving around her cabin, sweeping back and forth across the collapsed roof and broken windows like the searchlights of a prison yard. The men carrying them were just dark, bulky shapes, phantoms in the storm. They weren't looking for survivors of an accident. They were searching, organized, methodical. Her stomach plunged, a feeling of falling from a great height. They were hunting for the box. They were hunting for her. One of the flashlight beams settled on the front door of her cabin. There was a moment of stillness, and then a loud, splintering crash echoed faintly through the roar of the wind. Even from this distance, the sound was brutal, final. They had smashed the door in. They were inside. Sarah imagined them tearing the place apart, their muddy boots trampling over the floor where Matthew had played, their hands tossing aside the meager belongings she had left behind. She pictured them finding the empty space beneath the loose floorboard. The thought sent a jolt of pure ice through her. When they found the hiding place empty, they would know for certain. They would know she had the box, and they would know she had run, and there was only one place she could have run to. Their search would not end at the cabin. It would lead them here. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, her vision tunneling until the only thing she could see was the two bobbing lights in the stormy darkness. They were a violation, a cancer on the landscape, a physical manifestation of Caldwell's evil come to her sanctuary. Her mind replayed his words, his voice a silken, venomous whisper. Tragic accidents happen. This was it. This was the accident. Two men, a dark and stormy night, a single mother and her child alone in a derelict cabin. No one would question it. No one would investigate. They would be just another ghost story told in the hollow, another secret swallowed by the woods. The sheer cold-blooded calculation of it all was overwhelming. She felt a wave of dizziness, and she gripped the windowsill to keep from falling, the rough wood digging into her palms. Peterson turned from the window, his face a grim, stony mask in the firelight. The weary guilt was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He didn't say a word. He walked to the stone hearth, reached up, and took down an old, long-barreled hunting rifle that had been resting on two wooden pegs above the mantel. The metallic click of him checking the chamber was the loudest sound Sarah had ever heard, a sound that cut through the storm and her own panicked breathing with absolute, deadly clarity. He looked at her, his sharp eyes holding hers. He wasn't the scared young man who had hidden from the digging anymore. He was a guardian, making his last stand. "They won't find you tonight," he said, his voice a low, steady growl. "I made a promise to that boy Richard. I won't be a coward again." The night stretched before them, a terrifying black void filled with rain, thunder, and the certainty of violence. The rifle remained a cold, heavy promise in Mr. Peterson's hands as the chaos of the storm raged. The low growl of the truck engine was gone, replaced by a silence more terrifying than any noise. But instead of violence, a different sound cut through the night. The sharp, insistent ringing of Peterson's old rotary phone, a sound so archaic and out of place it felt like a hallucination. His eyes, burning with a lifetime of pent-up resolve, never left the dark window as he picked up the receiver. "David," he said, his voice a low growl, devoid of pleasantries. Sarah could only hear one side of the conversation, a series of clipped, urgent statements. "They're here, son." "Yes." "The Caldwell situation. It's worse. There's a witness. The heir. She has the proof." "No, the state police are his. I need your friends, David. The ones in Washington, the ones who don't take orders from men like him." He listened, his knuckles white on the receiver. "Tonight. I'll hold them off. Just get them here by dawn." He hung up the phone. The silence it left behind a deafening mix of hope and terror. Dawn did not creep into the hollow. It was escorted. As the storm finally broke, leaving a world washed clean and dripping, two silent, black SUVs materialized at the end of Peterson's muddy lane. They moved with an unnerving quiet, their tires barely whispering on the wet earth. Men in plain, practical clothes emerged, their faces grim and professional, their movements economical and sure. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just a calm, overwhelming display of power that was the polar opposite of Caldwell's thuggish force. A tall woman, with sharp, intelligent eyes, approached the cabin, her gaze taking in Sarah's disheveled state and Peterson's rifle with a single, appraising sweep. "Ma'am, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm Special Agent Davies, FBI. We understand you have something for us." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet solidify. The cavalry hadn't just arrived. They had brought a different set of rules to a lawless land, a rule book that Judge Caldwell couldn't burn. Sarah's hands trembled violently as she retrieved the backpack. The rusted metal box felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a condensed sphere of pain, grief, and terror. She pulled it out and held it toward Agent Davies, a silent offering. The agent didn't flinch or recoil. She produced a pair of latex gloves and took the box with a gentle, practiced reverence, as if accepting a holy relic. "We'll take it from here, Sarah," Davies said, her voice softening for the first time. As the agent placed the box into a secure evidence case, a profound physical change occurred in Sarah. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in a permanent state of tension, slumped with relief. A weight she hadn't even been fully conscious of. The terrible burden of being the sole guardian of so many ghosts was lifted. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of fear or sorrow. It was a tear of release, a final, shuddering exhale after years of holding her breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. The arrest of Judge Caldwell was an exercise in quiet efficiency. While he slept in his sprawling, opulent mansion, surrounded by manicured gardens and stolen artifacts, a silent perimeter was established. There was no dramatic raid, just a firm, early-morning knock on his massive oak door. When he answered, dressed in a silk robe, his face a mask of annoyed condescension, his eyes widened in genuine shock. He wasn't looking at a local sheriff he could dismiss, but at a team of grim-faced federal agents led by Agent Davies, holding a warrant with his name on it. His mask of civility shattered, revealing the snarling, impotent rage of a cornered predator. The words "tragic accidents" seemed to hang in the air around him as they snapped the cuffs on his wrists. The sight of this powerful man, who had acted like a king in his Valley of Shadows, being led away from his palace of lies like a common criminal, was a justice so pure it was almost dizzying for Sarah to watch on the newsfeed later. In the sterile, controlled environment of an FBI forensics lab far from the Appalachian Hollow, Richard's desperate gamble paid off. The brittle letters were carefully preserved, their frantic script analyzed, every word a nail in his father's coffin. In the hushed red light of a darkroom, the photographic negatives, after decades of waiting in the dark, were brought to life. Ghostly images slowly sharpened into horrifying clarity on the photographic paper. There was a younger Judge Caldwell, his face twisted in a sneer of triumph, holding a delicate necklace up to the light. There were close-ups of the stolen jewelry and chillingly clear photographs of the ledger pages Richard had described, detailing the extortion and the names of his victims, with the Martinsons at the top of the list. Richard's voice, silenced so long ago, was now shouting from beyond the grave, his testimony undeniable, his proof irrefutable, his love for his unborn son, a final act of righteous vengeance. Following the crude coordinates on the coffee-stained napkin, a team of agents dug into the damp earth at the spot marked with a fading XE. The shovels made a hollow, sickening sound as they struck wood. They carefully excavated the area, unearthing the remains of a large, eroded chest. As they pried open the lid, the contents were not the glittering fantasy of a pirate's treasure. It was a sordid, tragic hoard. Gold coins, dulled by decades in the damp soil, were piled next to tarnished silver lockets and mud-caked rings, their stones dark and lifeless. A child's silver bracelet lay coiled at the bottom, a heartbreaking testament to the family that had been erased. Seeing the images later, Sarah felt no thrill of discovery, only a profound, gut-wrenching sadness. This wasn't a reward. It was an exhibit in a murder trial, the final, material evidence of the evil that had festered under the soil of her land for nearly half a century, the price of a family's life. Weeks later, Sarah sat in a quiet, sunlit office in a federal building, a world away from the grime and decay of the cabin. A calm, compassionate prosecutor from the Department of Justice sat across from her. He explained that Judge Caldwell and his thugs had been indicted on a host of federal charges, from racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder, with the Martinson cold case now a leading homicide investigation. Because the crimes had been committed on her inherited land and her courage had been instrumental in bringing a major corruption ring to justice, she was entitled to a substantial reward from a federal victims fund. When he named the amount, the number was so large, so impossibly grand, that Sarah just stared, unable to process it. It was more money than she could have earned in 100 lifetimes of mending torn seams. In the same meeting, he handed her the fresh, clean deed to the property, her name printed in bold, official ink. The land and its ghosts were finally, legally and safely hers. Months passed. The sound that now echoed through Black Bear Hollow was not the splintering of rotten wood or the roar of a storm, but the rhythmic thud of hammers and the clean, buzzing song of power saws. Where the derelict, skeletal ruin had once stood, a new structure was rising, its frame of fresh, pale pine smelling of promise and sunlight. Sarah stood on the porch, not the listing, rotted platform of before, but a wide, solid deck, a cup of real coffee warming her hands. She wasn't a hunted victim anymore. She was a homeowner, a project manager, conferring with the builders, making decisions. The haunted, gaunt look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a clear, confident light. Her hands, once raw and pricked from endless mending, were now steady. She was rebuilding more than a cabin. She was rebuilding her life, plank by plank, nail by nail, turning the very sight of her deepest despair into a testament to her survival, a fortress of her own making. The new cabin was a haven of light and warmth. In the kitchen, a gleaming stainless steel refrigerator stood humming, its door covered in Matthew's crayon drawings, its shelves overflowing with fresh fruit, milk, and everything a growing boy could want. The air smelled of baking bread, not of mold and rat droppings. In the corner of the cozy living room, by a window that looked out onto the peaceful, sun-dappled woods, sat a state-of-the-art sewing machine. Sarah sat before it, not desperately patching holes for a few dollars, but joyfully stitching a colorful quilt, a tapestry of their new life. Matthew sat at a sturdy oak table, no longer huddled on a dirty floor, his homework spread out under the warm glow of a lamp. The silence was deep and peaceful, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth and the gentle whir of the machine. It was the quiet of safety, the quiet of a future that was no longer a thing to be feared, but a thing to be savored. Sarah placed a steaming plate of roasted chicken and vegetables in front of Matthew, a meal that would have seemed like an impossible fantasy just a year ago. She sat down, looking at her son's happy, healthy face, then around at the warm, beautiful home she had built from the ashes of a nightmare. The memory of the $87, the eviction notice, the empty fridge, felt like a story about a different person in a different lifetime. She had not only survived, she had triumphed. She had honored Richard's sacrifice, brought justice to the fallen, and forged a future for her son on the very land that had been cursed by a monster's greed. She had found her redemption not in a buried treasure of gold, but in the quiet, simple abundance of a peaceful life. Sarah's journey from the depths of despair to this moment of peace is a testament to a mother's strength. If her story moved you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss another tale of struggle and survival.